Okay, let's start today by taking a hammer to a fairy tale.
Ooh, I like the sound of that. Which one?
It's a big one. It's a story we've all been told, since we were in grade school civics class.
Right.
And it goes something like this. The world is a big, friendly neighborhood. We have rules, we have international law, we have the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and everyone.
Everyone plays by the same rule.
Exactly. Whether you're a giant superpower or a tiny island nation, you play by the same rulebook. It's fair. It's just, and it has this very fancy name, the Rules-Based International Order.
Sounds nice, doesn't it? It sounds lovely. It's the bedrock of Western diplomacy.
Or at least it's the bedrock of the brochure we hand out to everyone else.
That's a good way to put it. The brochure.
Exactly, the brochure. But what if I told you that one of the architects of that very system, a man who's been at the absolute pinnacle of global finance and politics, just quietly admitted that the brochure was, well, a lie.
Not just a lie, but
He used the words partially false.
it's a startling moment. You're referring, of course, to the comments by Mark Carney.
Mark Carney. And, let's be clear about who we're talking about here. This isn't some fringe blogger in a basement.
No, not at all.
This is the former governor of the Bank of England, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, a man who is basically royalty in the world of central banking and is, often tipped as a future prime minister of Canada.
The ultimate insider.
The ultimate insider. And he's at the World Economic Forum, the inner sanctum of the global elite in Davos, and he says out loud that the story of the rules-based order was partially false.
That is the definition of saying the quiet part loud.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
He admitted that the strongest powers, and let's be real, he means the U.S. and its closest allies, always exempted themselves when convenient.
When convenient.
And that phrase, it just stuck in my throat when I read it in our source material. Because look, we're not naive. We get it.
Of course. We know politicians spin things. We know there's real politics.
But for a guy like Carney to call the rules-based order a story we told ourselves, it feels like the pilot coming over the intercom and saying, folks, just so you know, the wings are made of cardboard.
It is a bit like that. But let's double click on what he actually means by false.
Right.
He's not saying the treaties and the institutions didn't exist.
No, of course not.
He's saying the application of the rules was optional for the big guys.
Right. So if I'm a small country, say Belgium, or even a mid-sized one like Canada where he's from, I have to follow the rules. If I break a trade agreement, I get sanctioned. I get crushed.
Exactly. For you, the law is gravity. It's physics. You have no choice but to obey it.
But Carney is admitting that for the hegemon, for the United States and its inner circle, the law wasn't gravity.
Oh, it was a speed limit sign.
And you can speed if you're driving the police car.
Precisely. And for 80 years, the story, as he puts it, was that the police car was subject to the same laws as your bicycle.
A story everyone in that room in Davos knew was a lie.
They all knew. The elite, the bankers, the leaders, they knew the U.S. exempted itself whenever it was convenient. But, and this is the key insight from the transcript we are analyzing today, he's only admitting it now because the story has stopped working. The cardboard wings are starting to look pretty frayed.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We're looking at a really fascinating, frankly intense roundtable discussion from a source called Lighthouse TV. And this isn't just about one soundbite from one banker.
No, it's about the collapse of the dominant global structure of the last 80 years.
We're going to be connecting some massive dots today. We're looking at this concept of the Anglo-American Empire, which the source argues is different from just America, the hollowing out of Europe, and this really deep theoretical framework that goes back centuries, the battle between land power and sea power.
And it touches everything. We've got the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, Donald Trump's strange obsession with buying Greenland, and even a philosophical look at why some modern nations act like, well, pirates.
It's a dense web of information for sure.
It is. But when you start to pull the threads, the picture that emerges is, well, it's very clear. We are absolutely witnessing the end of an era.
So let's stay on this Carney confession for a minute. Because the source material we're working with, it really emphasizes a specific word Carney used. He said countries like Canada prospered under this partially false story.
Yes, and that word choice is crucial. It's so telling.
Why prospered? What does that imply?
It implies a transaction, a deal. He's saying, yes, we knew the rules were rigged. We knew the U.S. was the bully who didn't have to follow the law. But we, the smaller Western nations, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK to an extent, We prospered because we were protected by the bully.
It's like being the little brother of the school bully.
Go on.
You talk a big game about how violence is wrong to everyone else, but you're secretly glad your big brother can beat up anyone who looks at you funny.
Yeah.
You get the benefits of the intimidation without having to do it yourself.
That's a very apt analogy, but the source points out that the dynamic is shifting. The deal is changing.
It's no longer just about protection.
No, it's about absorption. The discussion in the source moves pretty quickly to the specific vulnerability of Canada. Carney says Canada prospered, but the tone of the analysis suggests that prosperity is now under threat.
And this is where they bring up this anxiety that Canada is slowly, quietly becoming just the 51st state of the U.S.
They use the word annexation, which sounds so extreme, doesn't it?
It sounds like something from the 19th century.
Yeah.
I mean, Canada is a G7 nation. The idea of the U.S. just taking it, it sounds like fiction.
It does, until you look at a map. And that's what the source did. They connected it to geography, and honestly, I had to pause and really think about it.
So walk us through that.
Right. Look at the map. You have Alaska to the Northwest American Territory.
Okay.
You have the continental United States to the south.
Obviously.
And then to the northeast, you have Greenland. And this is where the source connects a very specific dot that most people dismissed at the time, Donald Trump's interest in buying Greenland.
I remember when that happened. Everyone laughed. It was a meme.
It was a global punchline. Trump wants to buy Greenland. It sounded like a Monopoly game gone completely wrong.
But the analysts in the source, they're not laughing.
No, they're taking it very, very seriously. And you have to ask yourself, why would a U.S. president, even one as unconventional as Trump, float that idea? It's not about buying ice.
It's about the Arctic. It's about strategic positioning.
It's about strategic encirclement. The speakers in the source argue that this wasn't an absurd whim. It was a geopolitical signal.
A signal of what?
That if the U.S. controls Alaska, the mainland, and then effectively integrates Greenland into its sphere of influence, Canada is physically sandwiched.
It's completely surrounded. There's no way out that isn't controlled by the U.S.
Completely. And the source treats the potential annexation or, deep integration of these territories not as some wild fantasy, but as part of a coming geopolitical reality.
So the argument is that for a figure like Carney to come out now and say the rules were a story, it's a signal that Canada knows its sovereignty is conditional.
Exactly. The protection was nice while it lasted, but now the bill is coming due. If the U.S. decides it needs Canada's resources, its water, its oil, its land, to compete with other great powers, the rules won't stop them.
Because, as Carney himself admitted, the big guys exempt themselves.
Precisely. And the little brother protection racket only works as long as the big brother feels generous.
When the big brother gets desperate, he might just take your lunch money.
Or your whole country.
That is a chilling thought, especially for our Canadian listeners. But the source zooms out even further. They argue that this isn't just about America acting impulsively or Trump being Trump. This is the continuation of a strategy that has been in play since the 19th century.
They call it the Great Game.
Okay, we need to unpack this, because usually when people say the Great Game, they mean the spy games between Britain and Russia in the 1800s over Afghanistan and Central Asia.
Right. Kipling and all that.
But the source is applying it to the entire globe right now.
Correct. The Dutch analysts in the source argue that the grand strategy of the British Empire was seamlessly adopted by the American Empire after World War II.
They treat them almost as one continuous entity.
Yes, the Anglo-American power. And they say this power had one primary strategic goal for the last 150 years, to dismantle classic empires.
Define classic empires for me in this context. What are we actually talking about? Who are the targets?
They list them explicitly in the source. You're looking at the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, even the old Spanish Empire.
Okay, so what do those all have in common? What makes them classic?
Land. Lots and lots of it.
No.
Bingo. These were land-based powers. They had vast contiguous territories, deep cultural roots, and they were largely self-sufficient. They didn't necessarily need global trade to survive because they had the resources, the agriculture, the population, all within their own borders.
And the Anglo-American strategy, which is all about the Navy, about trade, about finance, saw these big land empires as rivals.
Worse than rivals. They saw them as existential threats.
What? Existential.
Think about it. If you are an island nation like Britain, or a continent-sized island like the U.S., which is effectively an island between two oceans, your power comes from controlling the seas and the global trade routes. Your absolute nightmare is that the big land powers, Germany and Russia, for example, get together.
Because if Germany, with all its industry and technology, links up with Russia, with all its infinite resources.
They don't need the ocean. They don't need British ships or American banks. They become a self-contained fortress, a world island.
A fortress that the sea powers can't touch.
Exactly. They become unstoppable. So the source argues that the Great Game was a consistent, century-long push to break these empires up, to prevent that Eurasian superstate from ever forming.
So you're saying the argument is that World War I, World War II, the Cold War, this wasn't just a series of random conflicts, this was a structured plan.
That is the thesis presented in the source. They argue that the British and Americans worked, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, to keep Germany and Russia apart at all costs, to play them off each other.
And they argue that this job was largely successful.
Look at the results. Those old empires fell. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was sliced up into a dozen little countries after World War I. The Ottoman Empire sliced up. The Soviet Union eventually broken up.
And once these empires are broken up into smaller pieces, they can't be self-sufficient anymore.
Right. If you're a tiny country like, say, Hungary or Slovakia, you don't have all the resources you need. You have to trade. You need loans to rebuild. And who runs the global trade and the international loans?
London and New York.
Precisely. The Anglo-American axis. You break up the land powers and force the pieces into your sea-based financial system.
But here's where the source gets really spicy. They don't just say, America runs the world. They keep emphasizing the Anglo part. They seem utterly convinced that the British are still pulling a lot of the strings.
This is one of the most provocative claims in the source, and it's worth dwelling on. We often think of the UK today as America's junior partner, right?
The poodle, as it's sometimes called.
Exactly. We see the Prime Minister visiting the White House and just nodding along. But the source completely flips that dynamic. They suggest that the British banking and intelligence apparatus, specifically MI6 in the City of London, is still a massive power behind the power.
A sort of deep state that survived the end of the British Empire.
And not only survived, but found a new, much larger host to operate through the United States.
And they tie this directly to the World Economic Forum. Now, usually, when you hear about the WEF, it's all about the Great Reset or, globalism in general. But the source gets very specific about its founder, Klaus Schwab.
They do. They cite a book by an author named Richard Poe. The allegation, and let's be very clear, this is the source's allegation, we're reporting on their claims, is that Klaus Schwab wasn't just some independent Swiss professor who had a good idea for a conference.
What's the claim, then?
The claim is that he was identified and essentially installed in 1971 as a protege of powerful British interests. They even mention a specific connection to British intelligence.
So the argument is that the World Economic Forum isn't some neutral body trying to improve the state of the world, as its motto says.
According to the source, absolutely not. They argue the WEF acts as a tool and instrument for this ongoing Anglo-American strategy. Its purpose is to maintain the dominance of corporations in finance, specifically Anglo-American finance over sovereign nations.
It's about making sure that money rules, not governments.
Exactly. And that the people who control the money continue to be based in London and New York.
That actually makes the whole Great Reset idea sound less like some sci-fi conspiracy plot and more like a corporate merger. It's about standardizing the world's operating system so it's easier to manage and profit from by the people who own the banks.
That's a great way of putting it. And they point to current events to back this up. They mention British intelligence operations not just historically, but right now. In Ukraine, in Israel, and even in Azerbaijan.
The pipeline mention was really interesting.
It was. They point out that wherever there is a strategic flashpoint, especially around energy infrastructure, like the pipelines running from Azerbaijan through to the Mediterranean, you find British fingerprints.
Why there?
Well, who owns a massive stake in those pipelines? BP British Petroleum. The source argues that MI6 was still hyperactive in shaping these conflicts to ensure that resources continue to flow in a way that benefits this Anglo-American bloc. It's the great game still being played today with pipelines instead of mountain passes.
It really reframes how you look at the news. You see a conflict erupt and think, well, it's about local politics or ancient history. But this perspective says, no, look for the pipeline, look for the bank, look for the quiet British intelligence officer in the background.
It's a cynical view, for sure, but it provides a consistent logic for a lot of events that otherwise seem chaotic. If your grand strategic goal is to keep the land powers weak and divided, then constant instability in the regions that connect them is actually a success for your strategy.
Which brings us directly to Section 3, Europe. Because if the U.S. and U.K. are the bosses, the sea powers, as the source calls them, what on earth is the rest of Europe?
A vassal.
The source had this incredible quote from a Belgian politician, Bart de Wever.
Being a happy vessel is one thing. Being a miserable slave is something else.
Oof, miserable slave. That is not diplomatic language, is it?
No, it's not. And the source notes he actually said vessel, but in the context, it's pretty clear he meant vassal, a subordinate state.
So what's the context here? Where is he saying this?
He was speaking on a panel at the WEF, funnily enough, about redefining Europe's place. And he was expressing this deep existential frustration.
Frustration with who?
With the United States. He argues that for a long time, Europe was willing to be a happy vassal. We let the U.S. run foreign policy, we let them handle our defense through NATO, and in exchange, we got cheap goods, protection, and stability. We were subservient, but it was a comfortable subservience.
It was the golden cage. We didn't have to worry about the wolves outside, so we didn't mind the bars on the windows.
Exactly. But de Wever is saying the deal has changed. He mentions that Europe tried to appease the U.S., specifically talking about the new dynamics under a figure like Trump, but that red lines are now being crossed.
What kind of red lines?
He talks about tariffs being slapped on European goods, about the wavering support for Ukraine. He's essentially saying, wait a minute, we are doing everything you tell us to do, and you're still treating us like dirt. The master is no longer benevolent.
And the source takes this even further. They don't just say Europe is being mistreated. They use this term hollowed out. And this is where I want to pause and really explain what they mean, because it's not just a metaphor. It feels deeply economic.
It is deeply economic. Think about it like this. Imagine you own your house, but then to get some cash, you sell your car, but you lease it back from the dealer.
Okay, I'm with you.
Then you sell your furnace, but you pay a monthly fee to a company to run it for you. Then you sell the pipes, the electrical wiring. You still live in the house, it looks the same from the street, but you don't own any of the mechanics of it anymore. You are just a tenant in your own life.
And every month, the rent on all those individual pieces goes up.
Right. The source argues this is what happened to Europe under the banner of neoliberalism. It wasn't just opening markets, it was a fire sale.
A fire sale of what?
They claim that over the last few decades, key European assets, public utilities, infrastructure, even things as basic as city bus companies have been sold off. And who bought them?
Let me guess. Hedge funds.
American, Canadian, and British hedge funds. The source argues that Europe has been emptied. The wealth, the actual ownership of the continent's operating systems, has been transferred out.
So when a European leader today wants to, say, lower energy prices for their people,
they look at the control panel and realize none of the buttons work anymore. The wires all lead to a dashboard in a skyscraper in Connecticut or the city of London.
wow, that explains the hollowed-out description perfectly. It's a shell, it looks like a sovereign continent, but the insides, the vital organs, belong to someone else.
And it's not just the economic assets inside Europe. The source brought up the decolonization aspect, particularly regarding France. This was fascinating. The idea that France is finally and truly losing its grip on Africa.
Yes, they talked about the end of the France-Afrique system. Can you explain that a bit? Because I know France has a lot of history in Africa, but I didn't realize it was still so active.
It was very active. For decades after formal independence, France maintained immense power in its former colonies through something called the CFA franc.
That's a currency, right?
It's a currency used in West and Central Africa. But here's the catch. It was effectively controlled by the French treasury in Paris. It required these African nations to keep a huge chunk of their national currency reserves in France.
So France basically controlled their wallets. If you control a country's money, you control the country.
Their wallets and their security via a network of military bases. The source notes that in the last few years, and especially the last year or two, this entire system has collapsed.
How so?
There have been a series of coups in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and the new governments are explicitly anti-French. They're kicking French troops out. They're attacking the CFA franc.
And the source interprets this as the final nail in the coffin for Europe as an independent power player. The end of its own mini-empire.
Yes. They argue that without those colonies and that steady stream of resource extraction, think cheap uranium for French nuclear plants, for example, France shrinks. Europe shrinks. The source uses very diminishing language. They call Europe a small continent, impoverished, cut off from raw materials.
It paints a very bleak picture. Europe is stripped of its internal assets by hedge funds, stripped of its external empire in Africa, and now realizes its protector, the U.S., doesn't really care about its well-being anymore.
And that sense of betrayal is palpable in the source. They describe elites like Bart DeWeever as feeling betrayed by their master. They played the game, they followed the rules, the fake rules that Mark Carney talked about, and now they are left holding the bag.
And the personification of that betrayal, the guy who is really rubbing their faces in it, is Donald Trump. Which brings us to Section 4. We absolutely have to talk about the Trump factor.
We do, and it's interesting because the source doesn't view him through the typical American political lens of he's crazy or he's a savior.
Right, they don't seem to see him as just a chaotic madman. They see him as efficient. Is that the right word?
Efficiently brutal. The expert in the source argues that Trump is strategic, but strategic for America, not for the so-called Western alliance. They use this comparison of a good cop, bad cop routine.
Yeah, tell me more about that. They mentioned Keir Starmer, the UK leader.
Right. So the source posits this idea. You have a leader like Starmer or maybe Biden who plays the good cop, polite, diplomatic, talking about international law and our shared values.
The old story.
The old story. Then you have Trump, who plays the bad cop, threatening tariffs, demanding payment for NATO, insulting leaders on Twitter. But the source suggests the underlying mechanism of control remains exactly the same.
It's just a different method of extracting value from the vassals.
Exactly. The good cop says, please give us your money, friend, for our mutual benefit. And the bad cop says, give me the money or I'll break your legs. But either way, you're giving them the money.
Laughs, essentially. And the source points out that this extraction is happening through very specific mechanisms. One they really focus on is military dependency. They were very harsh on the F-35 fighter jet.
They called it inferior, and they said Europe is forced to buy it.
But why forced? Can't Europe build its own planes? I mean, there's Airbus, there's Saab in Sweden, Dassault in France.
Well, the source argues that Europe was encouraged to dismantle its own independent defense capabilities over decades, to rely on the U.S. and NATO. They mentioned Pim Fortuyn, the assassinated Dutch politician from the early 2000s.
Oh, wow. Bringing up Pim Fortuyn, that's a deep cut for an international audience.
Yes. The source alleges that Fortune was exploring non-U.S. military options for the Netherlands, like buying jets from Saab, the Swedish manufacturer, instead of the American Joint Strike Fighter project, which became the F-35.
And the implication is?
The implication, and again, this is the source's speculation, not ours, is that seriously challenging the U.S. military-industrial complex is dangerous. Because Europe didn't develop its own high-end alternatives, it is now in a position where it's forced to buy the F-35, which the source describes as exorbitantly expensive and plagued with technical problems.
So it's a trap. It's a dependency trap. You don't build your own car because your rich neighbor promises to drive you everywhere for free. Then one day your neighbor says, actually, you have to buy my car. It costs triple what it should, and it breaks down a lot.
And if you don't buy it, I won't protect you from the wolves anymore. It's a way to funnel European taxpayer money directly into the U.S. military-industrial complex. The source calls it tribute.
A modern form of tribute. And the other prong of this tribute is energy. This is where the Nord Stream pipeline comes in. The source was incredibly blunt about this.
No ambiguity there.
They asserted that the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were destroyed specifically to force Europe to buy American LNG, liquefied natural gas.
And this connects back to the currency, to the petrodollar. This is a concept we should probably explain for anyone who's not familiar.
Please, give us explain it like I'm 5 on the petrodollar.
Okay, simply put, since the 1970s, there's been an agreement that the world buys and sells oil and gas in U.S. dollars. If you are France and you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you have to get U.S. dollars first to pay for it.
Which means every country on Earth needs a big stash of dollars.
Exactly. This creates a massive, constant, artificial demand for U.S. dollars, which keeps the currency strong and allows the U.S. government and its people to borrow and spend very, very cheaply. It's the foundation of American economic power.
Okay, so if Europe buys cheap natural gas from Russia through a pipeline,
they might pay for it in euros or in rubles. That entire massive trade relationship happens outside the dollar system. It doesn't help the U.S. economy at all. In fact, it strengthens a rival currency.
But if the pipeline mysteriously blows up and Europe is suddenly desperate for gas and has to buy American LNG shipped across the ocean,
they have to pay for it in dollars.
And that transaction props up the whole U.S. currency system.
And it's much, much more expensive for the Europeans, which also deindustrializes a key economic competitor. The source argues the U.S. economy is fragile, and relies on these forced dependencies to stay afloat.
So blowing up the pipeline, or at least the permanent disconnection from cheap Russian energy, wasn't about saving Europe from Putin or some kind of moral clarity. The source claims it was a business move.
A cold, calculated business move. Trump's America First slogan is just a more honest and aggressive way of ensuring Europe keeps paying the rent, whether that's through buying LNG or F-35s.
It's a mafia protection racket. Nice continent you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to your energy supply. Oh, look, by coincidence, we have some very expensive gas to sell you.
And Europe, having been hollowed out and lacking its own army or independent energy sources, has no choice but to pay up.
Okay, so we've covered the politics, the economics, the military. It's a pretty dark picture. But the source takes a really interesting turn in the second half. They sort of zoom out, they stop talking about politicians and start talking about philosophy.
Yes, they bring up a book called Land and Sea by a German theorist named Carl Schmitt.
And this is the theoretical framework that ties the whole deep dive together.
It is, and we should spend some time here because this is the why behind everything we've just discussed.
Yeah.
Now, Carl Schmitt was a German jurist and political theorist, a very controversial figure, certainly, given his association with the Third Reich, so we need to put that on the table.
Right.
But his work on this concept of land power versus sea power is classic geopolitical theory, and it's what the analysts in the source use to make sense of the world today.
Okay, so break this down for us. What is a land power?
According to the source's reading of Schmitt, land powers are the historical empires. Think Russia, China, the old German or Spanish empires. Their entire identity is characterized by territory. They have clear borders, they are obsessed with stability, with culture, and with the metropolis, the capital city that exports civilization and order out to the provinces. They are rooted in the soil.
Roots, soil, borders. They are kind of like the farmers of history. They want to cultivate their land, grow things, and keep things orderly within their fences.
The farmer is a perfect analogy. They build walls to protect what's theirs. Now, contrast that with sea powers.
Who are the sea powers?
The source lists the Anglo-American bloc, the UK and the US, and historically the Dutch. Sea powers are characterized not by stability, but by movement. They are traders, they live on ships, they are focused on money, commerce, and opportunity.
And the source uses a very provocative word to describe them.
Pirates.
Pirates.
Yeah, that's a strong word.
Yes. And they don't mean it just as an insult. They mean it structurally, as a way of being. Think about the difference. A land power, the farmer, conquers territory to settle it, to build cities, and to spread its culture.
To make the conquered land part of the farm.
Exactly. A sea power, the pirate, conquers territory to extract its wealth and bring it back home. They don't care about the local culture. They care about the trade route. They care about controlling the port.
So the land power wants to make you a citizen. The sea power wants to make you a customer or a resource to be extracted.
Precisely. And what's amazing is the Dutch speakers in the source actually admit this about their own history. It's a moment of surprising and brutal self-reflection.
What do they say? They admit that the Dutch and British role historically was that of pirates. One of them says something like, "We didn't leave much culture behind in our colonies, we extracted wealth." They compare themselves to the Spanish or the French who, for all their faults, left behind language, religion, and architecture. The Dutch and British left. Well, they left banks and trade posts.
That's brutally honest. We were just here for the spices and the sugar, guys. Sorry about the mess.
And this dichotomy, this clash between the farmer and the pirate, between land and sea, is how they explain the current world conflict. The aha moment in the source is the argument that the long era of sea power dominance, the 500-year reign of the Anglo-American pirate traders, is ending.
The pirates are losing control of the seas.
In a way. The source argues we are seeing the return of the land. Old, massive, land-based entities like Russia and China are reasserting themselves. They are returning to their classical imperial modes. They are focused on territory, on culture, on their own borders. They are rejecting the fluid financial rules-based order of the sea powers.
So when you hear Vladimir Putin talk about Mother Russia, or Xi Jinping talk about 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, they aren't just using slogans.
No. According to this theory, they're operating on a completely different software. The land power operating system.
And the sea power system, which relies on everyone agreeing to play by the financial rules, to use the dollar to keep trade open, doesn't know how to handle a power that just says, I don't care about your banks, I care about this land. I don't care about your sanctions, I have my own resources.
It's like a pirate trying to blockade a farmer who grows his own food and has his own well. The blockade doesn't work.
There was a fascinating comment about Shanghai in there, too, that illustrates this.
Yes, the expert in the source described Shanghai as a pirate nest on the edge of the great Chinese land empire.
A pirate net.
Historically, it was the entry point for Western sea power for the British opium traders and merchants into the Chinese landmass. It was a place of finance and trade fundamentally different from the imperial capital in Beijing. It shows how these dynamics, the fluid, globalized trade of the coast versus the stability of the interior, are still playing out today.
So the grand thesis is, the sea powers, US, UK, have been running the show for centuries, and especially the last 80 years, setting the rules to favor their model of piracy or trade. But now, the land powers are big enough and strong enough to say, game over, we're closing the shop, we're going back to farming.
And Europe is stuck in the middle. This is the tragedy of Europe, according to the source.
How so?
Europe was a collection of land powers. It had deep culture, industry roots in the soil. But after World War II, it got converted. It became a vassal of the great sea power America. It adopted the sea power's values money over culture, trade over borders.
And now that the sea power is retreating, we're becoming more aggressive and less benevolent.
Europe has lost its original identity. It has no land power anymore, no great army, no energy resources, and it has no sea power. It doesn't control the world's currency or the major trade routes.
Talk about an identity crisis.
Yeah.
It's existential. The source paints a picture of Europe as a continent floating in the ocean without a boat.
A very powerful image.
Before we wrap up, I want to briefly touch on the sidebar this source included at the very end. They promoted an event called Battle for Science. It seemed a bit disconnected at first. We've been talking about empires and pirates, but then I realized it fits the theme perfectly.
What's the theme?
The theme is the collapse of the story.
Precisely. Just as the great geopolitical narrative, the rules-based order, is crumbling, the source suggests that the great scientific narratives are also under attack. They mention the activist Del Bigtree and this concept of inconvenient studies.
Right.
The idea that scientists are under immense pressure not to publish results that threaten established dogmas or, corporate interests or their own careers.
It reinforces this core idea that the official version of reality, whether it's about why a country is at war or how the global economy works or even what a scientific consensus is fracturing. People are looking for the man behind the curtain.
And in every instance, whether it's Mark Carney admitting the rules were fake or a whistleblower scientist, the source argues that what we find behind the curtain isn't some noble truth or set of objective rules.
It's just raw interest,
Mhm.
power, money,
Right.
career preservation.
The machinery, not the fairy tale.
So let's try to synthesize this massive download of information for everyone listening.
Let's do it.
We started with Mark Carney, the ultimate insider, admitting the rules-based order was basically a story the rich countries told the poor countries and themselves.
We move through the history of the Great Game, where the Anglo-American sea powers systematically worked to break up the Eurasian land powers to maintain their control of global finance and trade.
We saw how Europe was, in the source's words, hollowed out, economically and militarily becoming a miserable slave to a master that now wants to extract ever harsher rent via expensive F-35s and LNG.
And finally, we see the return of the land powers, like Russia and China, who are simply refusing to play the sea powers game anymore, which is throwing the entire Western system into a crisis of legitimacy.
It's a massive historical pivot. The big takeaway from this source is that the world we thought we lived in, the stable, predictable, rules-based world of the post-war era, was a temporary historical anomaly.
It was an anomaly based on total Anglo-American dominance, and that dominance is gone.
The source seems to think we're heading back to a much older world, a world of great empires and spheres of influence, a world where might makes right, or at least might makes the rules.
And a world where the story no longer works, the cardboard wings are falling off the plane, and everyone can see it.
So here's the provocative thought I want to leave you, our listeners, with today. The source painted this really stark picture of Europe as a hollowed-out vassal.
A museum, almost.
A museum, exactly. If the rules-based order was the story that kept Europe relevant and protected, what happens now that the cover's gone?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? If Europe has been emptied of its core assets, its defense industry, and its strategic independence, what is its future? Is it just a beautiful museum for tourists? Is it a permanent vassal state paying tribute to Washington? Or is there a path to becoming a land power again, to finding its own strength?
Can you regrow your roots after you've sold the soil they were in?
I don't know the answer to that. But based on the source material, the time for Europe to figure that out is running out very, very fast.
On that cheery note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's a lot to process, but I think it's crucial to look beneath the surface of the stories we're told.
Always, you have to question the story.
We'll see you next time.